Statistics can be cold, but sometimes they sound like a warning. In 1990s Russia, violent crime did not simply grow. It spread, quietly, stubbornly, as if the country itself had stopped resisting. People got used to things that should have been unthinkable. Shootings, explosions, contract killings, bodies in stairwells, gunfire at night, and worst of all, society began to adapt. There was, in that criminal world, an unspoken rule. Bandits could fight bandits. Groups could destroy each other. Money could be settled with blood. But there was one line that was not supposed to be crossed. A direct attack on the state, on those who represented force, on those who carried authority. When that line was crossed, it was more than a crime. It was a challenge. And in the autumn of 1994, in the city of Izhevsk, that challenge was made. Izhevsk was known across the world for metal and firepower. This was the city of the Kalashnikov rifle, the city of the Makarov pistol, a city where weapons were not an abstraction but part of daily industrial life. And in the chaos of the post-Soviet years, that reality became dangerous. Poor accounting, weak security, missing parts, stolen components, improvised assembly. What had once been controlled by the state now leaked into the streets. The result was predictable. The city filled with guns. And where guns multiplied, so did the gangs. At first, the case began like many others. In early October 1994, police in Izhevsk received operational information. A man named Boris Kutashev was allegedly preparing the contract murder of 3 businessmen. The names of the intended targets were known. The approximate date was known, enough to justify surveillance. Officers began tracking Kutashev's movements across the city. His car was followed. Addresses were logged. Contacts were noted. Every stop was checked. All day long, nothing. No weapons exchange. No suspicious meeting. No obvious preparation for murder. Late that night, Kutashev parked near an apartment building and entered the entrance hall. The surveillance team received orders to hold position. It could have remained a routine operation, a quiet watch, a waiting game, if not for one detail. Boris Kutashev was not just another suspect. He was the son-in-law of Nikolai Perevoshchikov, Deputy Minister of Internal Affairs of Udmurtia, and the apartment he entered that night belonged to Perevoshchikov. The officers stayed outside. Sometime later, a white Zhiguli pulled up. Nothing yet seemed extraordinary. Then, at around 4 in the morning, the duty unit in Izhevsk received a phone call. The caller was agitated, breathing hard, his voice trembling. He said that the deputy minister, Nikolai Perevoshchikov, had just been murdered in his apartment, along with members of his family. A cruel prank? A drunken lie? At first, perhaps it sounded that way, but then the caller identified himself. It was Boris Kutashev. The response team arrived within minutes. At the broken apartment door, investigators found a large boot print. There were traces of blood, spent shell casings, chaos. Inside, the scale of the crime became clear. Nikolai Perevoshchikov and his wife had been shot in their bed. Their family had been attacked with overwhelming violence. The elder son, Igor, had managed to shield his fiancée. By pure chance, she survived. The younger son, Sergei, hid beneath a table. The bullets missed him. But Perevozchikov's daughter, Tatiana, protecting her young son with her own body, was killed. The child lived. The daughter did not. The apartment floor was scattered with shell casings from a Kalashnikov rifle and a Makarov pistol. This was not panic, not an argument, not a drunken escalation. This was an execution, and the country reacted accordingly. The murder of a senior anti-organized crime official inside his own home, together with members of his family, sent shockwaves far beyond Izhevsk. It was not just the brutality, it was the message. Nikolai Perevozchikov was not a symbolic figure. He headed the fight against organized crime in the Republic. He had overseen serious operations. He had disrupted criminal networks. He had built cases. Not long before his death, he had appeared on local television. Calm, controlled, certain, a man used to danger, but not afraid of it. And now he was dead, in his own apartment, with his family around him. People across the country asked the same question. If the state cannot protect one of its own, who will protect everyone else? The funeral drew thousands. Residents of Izhevsk came to say goodbye. There was grief, shock, and beneath it all, fear. The case was placed under the highest level of control. Federal investigators became involved. A special team was assembled, and almost immediately, one figure drew attention. Boris Kutashev. He had survived. He had been inside the apartment, and according to his own account, in the darkness and confusion, he had recognized one of the gunmen, a man named Dmitry Peshkov, nickname Zhaba. That claim raised an obvious question. If Kutashev knew one of the attackers well enough to identify him under those conditions, what exactly was the nature of that connection? Within hours, Peshkov was arrested. Forensic examination confirmed that he had kicked in the apartment door. The boot print matched. Under questioning, he began to talk. He described the assault, the gunfire, the positions of the shooters, and then he named others. Now the case widened. Searches began. Phones were monitored. Addresses were watched. Known associates were checked, but some of the suspects had already vanished. They were placed on the federal wanted list. The names included Alexander Grishayev, Andrei Vershinin, and others tied to a violent criminal circle. As investigators dug deeper, the outline of the group emerged. One of its central figures was Dmitry Malyshev. He operated an illegal parking racket in Izhevsk, extorting car owners for so-called protection. That brought money, cars, loyal men, and eventually Kutashev joined him. The relationship between the men was built not on ideology, but on the usual things: profit, access, force, and ambition. Then investigators uncovered another layer. Malyshev had once worked with a local businessman named Kostin. At first they were close, business partners, even friends. There was home video footage of them together, hunting, traveling, laughing. Then they fell out over money. Not long after that, Kostin was murdered. At the time, the case had gone unsolved. Now, under pressure, a witness explained what happened. Kutashev had suggested the solution. not to confront Kostin personally, but to have him killed through intermediaries. Thus, the group's internal logic was formed. Once blood had been spilled together, everyone was trapped together. That is how gangs harden, not through friendship, through shared guilt. The investigation kept moving. There were more killings, more attempts. A grenade thrown into a businessman's apartment window. A botched contract shooting that left a witness alive. A later murder meant to erase that mistake. Each crime on its own had once looked separate. Now they formed a chain. The same names resurfaced. The same weapons. The same method of payment. The same appetite for easy money and growing confidence. A picture emerged of young men who had become used to violence very quickly. Their arsenal expanded. Their fear diminished. Their prices rose. By October 1994, Kutashev had reportedly been offered a new contract. 3 businessmen for $18,000. A huge sum for that moment. Far greater than many honest people would see in years. And greed, as often happens, destabilized the group from within. Kutashev intended to keep most of the money. Malyshev learned of it. That changed everything. According to the later reconstruction, Malyshev concluded that Kutashev had become dangerous. Too greedy, too independent, too ambitious, and perhaps too exposed. What followed was not simply revenge, it was preemptive elimination. On the night of October 8, Malyshev and the others climbed the stairs to Perevoshchikov's apartment. Up the stairwell, floor by floor, armed, prepared. They were not just going to kill Kutashev, they were going to erase the entire household. By then, the motive had become brutally practical. No witnesses, no loose ends, no future threat. Yet one detail made the case even darker. Kutashev himself survived. A man who had helped build connections with killers, now standing in the blood-soaked aftermath of a massacre that consumed his wife's family. At interrogations, the accused tried to separate pieces of the truth. Some minimized their role, some blamed others. Some admitted one crime, but not another. But evidence accumulated. Vershinin was eventually detained and led investigators to a body of water where the murder weapons had been discarded. After long searches, divers recovered both a Kalashnikov rifle and a Makarov pistol. The serial numbers had been removed, but ballistics told the rest. Those were the weapons used in the massacre. Now the circle was closing. Victims, weapons, participants, witness statements, recovered evidence. And then another unexpected turn. A man named Toporkov appeared voluntarily and began to confess his role on the margins of the group. At first he hoped to save himself by seeming minor a watcher, an information collector, a helper. But once he started talking, more details emerged. He described other murders, other contracts, other arrangements. A businessman named Vyshensky had been targeted. A grenade attack was ordered. By luck alone, people survived. Another man, Samarin, was later killed after a hired attacker agreed to do the job to pay off a debt. One by one, these episodes linked back into the same violent orbit. What had seemed like scattered underworld brutality was in fact one organized group testing itself, arming itself, and becoming bolder each time it escaped punishment. At one auto service station, Another businessman, Mikhail Tadze, was gunned down in front of witnesses. By the time investigators reconstructed the scene, almost nothing remained except fragments, burned metal, damaged personal items, traces of destruction. The body had been so badly burned that identification was difficult. But again, testimony and material evidence aligned. Meanwhile, the manhunt for the remaining fugitives continued. Photographs were distributed across police units. Relatives were watched. Friends were questioned. Known hideouts were checked. Public places were monitored. Finally, someone led investigators to an address. Kutashev was arrested. Only Malyshev remained. At the same time, officers intercepted several notes that Kutashev was trying to send to jailed accomplices. Their contents pointed again to the internal struggle over money and power. That struggle, investigators believed, was the immediate trigger for the massacre. Leadership in a gang means money. Money means control. Control means status. And in that world, status is defended with murder. The final operation to capture Malyshev was prepared carefully. By then, he had been hiding for months. There would be no improvisation, no mistakes. The arrest team moved in, fast, decisive, and at last, the man thought to be central to the massacre was in custody. During questioning, Kutashev and Malyshev each tried, in different ways, to manage the moral image of the dead deputy minister. They insisted Perevoshikov had been an honest man, that he knew nothing of the criminal dealings around him. On that point at least, there was little reason to doubt them. The tragedy of the case lies partly there. A man who fought organised crime, destroyed not in a distant ambush, not in a gun battle on the street, but at home, among family photographs, among familiar walls, a place where he should have been safest. There is one family photograph that says more than the case files ever could. Perevoshikov, his wife, his daughter, and beside them, Boris Kutashev, a young man with an ordinary face, respectable, almost soft in appearance, the kind of face people trust. Looking at it, it is hard to imagine that the future of everyone in that frame had already been placed, in part, in his hands, and that his choices would help lead them towards slaughter. That is one of the most unsettling truths in criminal history. The face of danger is rarely dramatic. It does not announce itself. It sits at the family table. It holds a child. It smiles at the camera. And then, one night, it opens the door to murder. In the 1990s, Russia learned this lesson again and again. Not only that, crime was growing. Not only that, gangs were becoming stronger, but that the line between private life and criminal violence had nearly disappeared. A contract killing no longer belonged only to the street. It could step into a bedroom, into a child's room, into a family's last ordinary evening. And once that happens, the country changes. The Izhevsk massacre became more than a case file. It became a symbol of the decade. A decade when firearms flowed from factories into criminal hands, when greed overpowered loyalty, when young men treated murder like employment, when even those inside the security system were no longer protected by the system itself. For investigators, it was a case of evidence, motive, and method. For the public, it was something simpler. A nightmare made real, a reminder that in the new Russia, violence had become confident, and confidence made it ruthless. The city remembered the funeral, the apartment, the shell casings, the staircase, the questions. People always ask how such things become possible. The answer is rarely sudden. First comes disorder, then impunity, then habit. And when society begins to accept the presence of armed men, contract killings, and criminal power as part of normal life, the next boundary is always easier to cross, until one day, someone crosses it inside the home of a deputy minister, and by then, it is already too late.